Los Angeles in the mid-1970s was a city seduced by its own image. It sold dreams, illusions, and second chances. Billboards stretched across Sunset Boulevard promising fame and beauty. Palm trees lined the sidewalks, and the sun seemed to shine just a bit longer than in any other city. But behind the glamour, something darker was beginning to take hold. The city had grown too fast. By 1975, L.A. was a sprawling metropolis with more than 500 miles of freeway slicing through its neighborhoods like veins. It was a city in motion, cars always moving, people always drifting. And within that movement, a predator could go unnoticed. Maybe even three of them. At the time, crime rates were rising, but not yet alarming. The LAPD and local sheriff departments were overwhelmed with gang activity, drugs, and political pressure. And so, when the first body was found, young, male, abandoned near a freeway on-ramp, it was written off. No ID, no wallet, just another dead teenager. They didn't know his name. No one filed a missing person report. He was a ghost before he died. And then it happened again. Another young man found strangled near Interstate 5. No signs of robbery, no indication of who he was. Just like before, the pattern continued. Every few weeks, another body. Always near freeways, always male, always young. Still, no one in law enforcement raised an alarm. The problem was systemic. Jurisdictional divides meant the LAPD didn't always share case details with the Orange County Sheriff's Department, or with San Diego, or Riverside. One county might label it a drug-related incident. Another might think it was gang violence. And another might just forget. This disconnect allowed the killings to slip through the cracks because there was no centralized database, no DNA testing, no behavioral profiling like we have today. There was only intuition and the occasional detective willing to ask too many questions. Meanwhile, the city kept moving. Teens kept arriving in L.A. by bus, by car, by the thousands. Some were escaping broken homes. Others had been thrown out for being gay. Most came with little more than hope and a backpack. They slept in parks, hitchhiked along the coast, or met strangers who offered them work, food, or a ride. And sometime, that ride was the last one they ever took. The LGBTQ+ community in Los Angeles began to whisper. Some said a man in a van was picking up boys near Santa Monica. Others said bodies were being found with ropes around their necks or cigarette burns on their arms. But when survivors went to the police, they were often ignored. The stigma was too strong. Homophobia wasn't just a social attitude. It was embedded in the system. Police didn't investigate dead gay teens the same way they would a white suburban girl. Reporters didn't chase those stories. Families were often too ashamed to speak publicly, or worse, they had disowned the victims long before their deaths. That silence became a weapon. By the time investigators began to notice a real pattern, around late 1978, there were more than 20 unsolved deaths of young men across Southern California, each with different levels of brutality. Some were shot, some strangled, some showed signs of extreme torture. The inconsistency made it harder to draw a direct line. But that's what made it so terrifying. These weren't the acts of one killer. Some of the murders were methodical, bodies washed, posed, carefully placed. Others were rage-filled, as if the killer had lost control. And then there were those that were cold, almost robotic. No signs of struggle, no fingerprints, no mercy. Eventually, detectives realized what they were looking at. Not a lone predator, but three. Three men hunting the same demographic. Three killers operating at the same time. Sometimes within miles of each other, never crossing paths, but somehow feeding off the same vulnerability. They each had their own method, their own motive, and their own monster inside. And Los Angeles, with its endless highways and transient population, was the perfect hunting ground. The freeway system was their accomplice. It allowed them to strike fast, travel far, and disappear into the noise of the city. No cameras, no toll booths, no neighbors who'd remember a stranger passing by. Victims could be abducted in one county, murdered in another, and dumped in a third. Jurisdictional chaos made tracking the killers nearly impossible, and by the time a body was found, the killer was already long gone. For the public, these deaths remained background noise. There were no major headlines, no citywide warnings. The victims were often listed as John Does, forgotten boys from forgotten towns. There were no vigils, no press conferences, no names. Just the occasional headline buried on page 8, teen found dead off freeway. Police investigate pattern in male deaths. Body count rises in unsolved killings. But behind those headlines, something was boiling beneath the surface. Some detectives started working overtime, off the books. They compared autopsy photos, reread police reports, met in secret to share theories. What they found disturbed them. Some of the victims had the same wrist ligature marks. Others had matching cigarette burns. A few had been drugged with tranquilizers. One had been castrated. Another had foreign objects inserted post-mortem. Each killer had a signature. Each victim had a story. But the city wasn't listening. By 1980, there were over 40 unsolved cases that fit the same general pattern. The number would rise even further before any of the killers were caught. But by then, the damage had already been done. Los Angeles had become a hunting ground, not for one predator, but for 3. And the scariest part, they were still out there. And one of them was just getting started. If the other freeway killers struck with chaos and cruelty, Patrick Kearney was different. He didn't scream. He didn't torture. He didn't rant about voices in his head or commit acts of ritualistic violence. He was quiet, controlled, and terrifyingly efficient. Born in East Los Angeles in 1939, Patrick Wayne Kearney was, by all outward appearances, an unremarkable man. He was small-framed, soft-spoken, and rarely raised his voice. He studied engineering, worked in aerospace, lived in the suburbs, a man who smiled politely to his neighbors and showed up to work on time. But beneath that ordinary exterior, something deeply broken had been brewing for years. Kearney's childhood was troubled. He was bullied, isolated, often made to feel weak and inadequate. He never truly connected with people. As a teenager, he developed violent fantasies, dark images that came to him during moments of frustration. But instead of acting on them immediately, he did something else. He waited. By his early 30s, Kearney had moved in with his longtime partner, David Hill, into a modest home in Redondo Beach. The 2 men kept to themselves. The neighbors described them as quiet, even boring. No one suspected that Kearney was leading a double life, one that involved long drives along the freeway and a trunk full of trash bags. Kearney's victims were typically young men or teenage boys. Many were hitchhikers. Some were runaways. Others were lured from gay bars or public parks. He targeted those who seemed vulnerable, those who wouldn't be missed right away. Once he had them alone, he acted swiftly. He would bring them to his car, and often there was no struggle, no fight. He used a small caliber pistol, silent, efficient, a single shot behind the ear. In his own words, he wanted it to be quick. But what came after the killings was what truly haunted investigators. Kearney was meticulous. After the murder, he would often take the body back to his home or a secluded place. There, he would dismember them with surgical precision. He washed the parts, wrapped them in plastic. Then he packed them, piece by piece, into large industrial-strength garbage bags. He disposed of them in dumpsters, desert areas, and off stretches of remote freeway. Some victims were never found. Others were identified only years later, through dental records or DNA long after his arrest. But the way he disposed of his victims earned him his nickname, the trash bag killer. There were no messages left behind, no rituals, no trophies. He didn't brag. He didn't leave behind clues to taunt investigators. In fact, he did everything he could to make the victims vanish completely. And for years it worked. From around 1974 to 1977, bodies began surfacing, limbs wrapped in black bags, torsos found in rural areas, remained so degraded that identifying them felt almost impossible. Police departments, still operating in silos, didn't realize they were dealing with the same killer. Different counties handled the reports. Few talked to each other. Kearney operated in the blind spots of a broken system. He wasn't just smart, he was invisible. But like most serial killers, his control began to slip. In March 1977, a 17-year-old boy named John LeMay went missing. He had told his mother he was going to visit someone named Dave in Redondo Beach. That one simple name would change everything. Investigators traced LeMay's last known whereabouts and eventually landed on the doorstep of Kearney and Hill. When questioned, both men were calm, almost too calm, but detectives noticed inconsistencies. Hill looked nervous. Kearney, meanwhile, seemed unbothered. They didn't press charges that day, but the pressure was building. Days later, both men fled. The moment Kearney left his home, he stopped being invisible. Authorities issued a warrant, searched the residence, and found evidence: bloody towels, hair samples, and fragments of bone. It was the first time police began to understand the scale of what they were dealing with. And then, in a move that no one saw coming, Patrick Kearney turned himself in. He walked into a Riverside County police station and calmly confessed to 21 murders. But it didn't end there. In the days that followed, Kearney sat down with detectives and laid out details that chilled even the most hardened officers. Dates, names, dump sites, methods. He spoke with clarity, no remorse. He remembered every face, every bag, every shot fired. He admitted to killing at least 28 young men and boys. Some investigators believe the real number may be higher, closer to 40, but with some victims never found, the full truth may never be known. Patrick Kearney was charged with 21 counts of murder. In 1978, he pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated at California State Prison in Mule Creek. What made Kearney especially terrifying wasn't just the number of victims or how long he got away with it. It was how quiet he was, how precise, how utterly invisible he had become in a world that refuses to see what it doesn't want to acknowledge. He wasn't fueled by rage. He didn't seek attention. There were no manifestos, no theatrics. He didn't think of himself as evil. He just was. Among the three Butchers of L.A., Kearney is often considered the least sensational. He didn't taunt the media. He didn't make headlines until after he confessed. But in many ways, he was the most effective, because he didn't need the world to know who he was. He only needed them to look the other way. William Bonin was not a quiet man. If Patrick Kearney operated in silence, hidden in shadows, Bonin did the opposite. He moved fast, aggressively, and without subtlety. And the pain he caused left a deeper mark, not only on his victims, but on the city itself. Born in 1947, William George Bonin grew up in an environment filled with hardship. From a young age, his life was shaped by instability and mistreatment. He was raised in a household that struggled with substance abuse and neglect. And by the time he was a teenager, Bonin had already been in and out of various institutions. Those early years were filled with unresolved trauma, and as he entered adulthood, something inside him had become disconnected. After serving in the U.S. Air Force during the Vietnam War, Bonin returned home and tried to rejoin society. He found work delivering goods across Southern California and lived in Downey with his mother. But beneath that normal surface, darker thoughts were already taking root. By the late 1970s, Bonin had begun approaching teenage boys and young men, often those who were walking alone, waiting near convenience stores or looking for a ride. His van, a green Chevrolet, became a tool of manipulation. He would offer a lift, sometimes with the promise of kindness or safety, but those who accepted would not come back. Bonin's actions were severe and, over time, increasingly dangerous. He did not act alone. He involved others, young men who either feared him, followed him, or were pulled into his world through emotional pressure. This detail set him apart from other killers of his time. He was not a solitary figure. He created an atmosphere around himself where violence became routine. Between 1979 and 1980, a growing number of young people were reported missing across Los Angeles and Orange County. Most were between the ages of 13 and 19. Their names were different, but the stories had tragic similarities. They were last seen alone. Some were on their way home. Others never made it to school. Their disappearances left families shattered, and yet the pattern wasn't noticed right away. Bonin had been in trouble with the law before. He had a history of inappropriate behavior toward minors and had even been evaluated by mental health professionals. One doctor, in fact, warned that Bonin had the potential to cause serious harm. But despite that warning, he was eventually released back into the community. That decision, though legal, would have devastating consequences. By 1980, police departments across Southern California began seeing a disturbing trend. Several boys had been found near freeway exits or rest areas. Some cases were connected by physical evidence, others by timing. Still, no one could pinpoint a name until a 14-year-old boy named Sean King went missing, and witnesses mentioned seeing a suspicious van in the area. Surveillance operations were set up. Officers quietly followed Bonin as he drove through neighborhoods, circling parks and bus stops. On June 11, 1980, he was seen trying to approach another young man. Police intervened just in time, stopping something terrible from happening again. When Bonin was arrested, investigators found items in his vehicle that pointed to far more than a single incident. They began retracing his movements, reviewing past missing persons cases, and interviewing former acquaintances. What they uncovered was a long list of young lives lost under similar circumstances. Eventually, Bonin was charged with over a dozen counts of murder. He stood trial in 1981, and the courtroom was filled with grieving families, each seeking answers. His accomplices were also brought in, and their testimonies painted a chilling picture of control and coercion. Bonin was convicted and sentenced to death in 1982. He remained on death row for more than a decade, showing little emotion or remorse. In 1996, he was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison. What makes William Bonin's story especially painful is that many signs had been there all along. He had been flagged by psychologists. He had a record. There were opportunities, moments where the system could have stopped him. But those warnings went unheeded. His case became a turning point in how California monitored parolees with violent histories. It forced lawmakers and law enforcement to reflect on how vulnerable communities were being protected, or, in many cases, ignored. William Bonin's crimes left a wound on Southern California that would take years to understand. He did not just take lives, he exposed the cracks in a city's system. And though he was eventually caught and punished, his legacy remains a painful reminder that the most dangerous people are not always those who hide. Sometimes they walk among us, unnoticed, until it's too late. Among the three men who terrorized Southern California's highways, Randy Kraft was perhaps the most chilling. Not because he was louder than Bonin or more methodical than Kearney, but because of his mind, cold, calculated, and eerily intelligent. Randy Stephen Kraft was born in 1945 in Long Beach, California, to a working-class family. He was the youngest of 4 children. Those who knew him in childhood described him as bright, articulate, and disciplined. He excelled in school, showed a keen interest in politics, and even studied economics at Claremont Men's College. He was the kind of student teachers admired, the kind of young man who seemed destined for a stable life. But behind that academic promise, there were secrets. During his college years, Kraft began to struggle with his identity. He was gay at a time when being open about that could ruin a career or sever family ties. That internal pressure built up quietly, silently. He was drafted into the Air Force in 1969, but was discharged shortly after for medical reasons, which were later revealed to involve questions about his mental health. After his return, Kraft found work as a computer programmer and lived what most would describe as a completely ordinary life. He had a steady job, a long-term partner, a circle of friends who considered him witty, even charming. But beneath that normality, he was keeping a list. His victims were almost always young men, many of them military servicemen, students, or hitchhikers traveling along the Pacific Coast Highway. He would often offer them a ride, a drink, or simply the safety of conversation. For a moment, he made them feel seen, safe, heard. Then they vanished. Kraft's approach was different from the others. He wasn't impulsive. He planned everything with precision. He selected his victims carefully and often sedated them using drugs or alcohol. Once unconscious or disoriented, He would take them to a secluded location, sometimes his home, sometimes a wooded area, far away from anyone who could intervene. What happened next varied. Some victims were subjected to extended violence. Others appeared to be handled with what investigators called forensic control. But the most disturbing part wasn't just the act, it was the documentation. Inside Kraft's car, after his eventual arrest, police found a notebook, a handwritten list. On it were dozens of cryptic entries, each one believed to represent a life he had taken. Some had initials, some used short descriptions, others were just numbers. There was no doubt it was a scorecard. The list contained over 60 entries, and yet at the time of his arrest, Kraft had only been linked to a small fraction of those through physical evidence. The rest, still under investigation, some likely lost forever. Families still waiting for closure, names never spoken aloud. The manhunt for Kraft wasn't like the others. It didn't begin with multiple bodies found in similar places. His victims were scattered in time and geography. The locations ranged from Oregon to Orange County. Some were never found at all. But in May 1983, his pattern was finally broken. California Highway Patrol officers pulled Kraft over for erratic driving near Mission Viejo. He was alone, except for one passenger, a young Marine, who appeared unconscious. When officers opened the door, they discovered the Marine had already passed away. The scene was horrifying. Kraft was arrested on the spot. In his vehicle, investigators found drugs, rope, photographs, and items that connected him to multiple cold cases. As they traced his past, more and more stories began to surface, each tied to a name, a face, and a grieving family. But Kraft refused to confess. Unlike Kearney, who offered names and dates, or Bonin, who admitted his crimes without remorse, Kraft remained silent. He denied everything. Even when the evidence became overwhelming, he insisted he had done nothing wrong. In 1989, he was convicted of 16 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. To this day, he remains on death row at San Quentin, maintaining his innocence. The scorecard, however, speaks louder than he ever has. Randy Kraft represents a different kind of horror, not one of rage or chaos, but of intellect without conscience. A man who lived a life of routine by day and meticulously organized terror by night. What made him so terrifying wasn't just what he did, it was how easily he did it without ever drawing attention. He didn't just slip through the cracks of the system, he walked beside it, head held high, shaking hands with neighbors, smiling at coworkers, attending dinner parties, all while keeping count. Of all the Butchers of L.A., Randy Kraft remains the most mysterious, because we may never know how many names should have been on that list, or how many families still wonder why their sons never came home. And sometimes that's the cruelest part of all, not the moment of loss, but the silence that follows. Los Angeles wasn't just a city, it was a machine, moving fast, expanding wide, and too busy to notice the people falling through its cracks. In the 1970s and early 80s, the city was exploding in size. Freeways stretched across the landscape, connecting neighborhoods but disconnecting people. It was easy to vanish here, and even easier to be ignored. That's exactly what the killers counted on. The freeway system made everything faster, especially for those trying to escape. A person could be abducted in one county, murdered in another, and dumped miles away, where a different police department would take over. Back then, departments didn't share information easily. Cases stayed local, clues were missed, victims fell between jurisdictions. And that wasn't the only problem. The truth is, many of the victims were kids the system didn't prioritize. Young men, runaways, LGBTQ+. Some were dismissed as drifters. Others never even got proper investigations. Families were told to wait, or that their child probably just left home. Media coverage was minimal. These boys weren't seen as headlines. The silence wasn't just a failure, it was a pattern. Detectives who tried to connect the dots were often working alone. There was no DNA database, no modern profiling, no urgency from leadership. By the time anyone realized there was a pattern, the body count had already grown. And while the city stayed distracted by Hollywood, the killers kept moving, using the freeways like arteries, slipping through places where no one was watching. It wasn't just about the killers. It was about a city that didn't want to see the truth. But some people did. Parents who wouldn't stop searching, officers who refused to close files, journalists who started asking the right questions. Bit by bit, the silence cracked. And eventually the truth came out. Three predators weren't just hunting victims. They were moving through a system too slow to catch them and too blind to try. This segment of Los Angeles history isn't just dark. It's a warning, because the same cracks still exist in other cities, in other systems, and when the world looks away, the worst people know how to hide. Los Angeles wasn't just a city, it was a machine. Moving fast, expanding wide, and too busy to notice the people falling through its cracks. In the 1970s and early 80s, the city was exploding in size. Freeways stretched across the landscape, connecting neighborhoods but disconnecting people. It was easy to vanish here, and even easier to be ignored. That's exactly what the killers counted on. The freeway system made everything faster, especially for those trying to escape. A person could be abducted in one county, murdered in another, and dumped miles away, where a different police department would take over. Back then, departments didn't share information easily. Cases stayed local, clues were missed, victims fell between jurisdictions. And that wasn't the only problem. The truth is, many of the victims were kids the system didn't prioritize. Young men, runaways, LGBTQ+. Some were dismissed as drifters. Others never even got proper investigations. Families were told to wait, or that their child probably just left home. Media coverage was minimal. These boys weren't seen as headlines. The silence wasn't just a failure, it was a pattern. Detectives who tried to connect the dots were often working alone. There was no DNA database, no modern profiling, no urgency from leadership. By the time anyone realized there was a pattern, the body count had already grown. And while the city stayed distracted by Hollywood, the killers kept moving, using the freeways like arteries, slipping through places where no one was watching. It wasn't just about the killers. It was about a city that didn't want to see the truth. But some people did. Parents who wouldn't stop searching, officers who refused to close files, journalists who started asking the right questions. Bit by bit, the silence cracked. And eventually the truth came out. Three predators weren't just hunting victims. They were moving through a system too slow to catch them and too blind to try. This segment of Los Angeles history isn't just dark. It's a warning, because the same cracks still exist in other cities, in other systems, and when the world looks away, the worst people know how to hide. Three men, three methods, one city that wasn't ready. Kearney killed quietly, Bonin with cruelty, Kraft kept score. They didn't work together, but their impact was the same. Dozens of young lives lost, some never identified, some never found. This isn't just a crime story. It's about a system that failed. It's about victims who were overlooked and families left searching for answers that never came. We share these stories not to glorify the killers, but to make sure the victims are remembered, to remind ourselves what happens when no one's paying attention. If this story moved you, share it, because sometimes the only thing standing between tragedy and justice is someone willing to speak up.